There we go. So, hey, hi everyone. Welcome from my home. Self-isolation can hit some harder than others. Sorry about that. Yeah, today we want to talk about debugging. I'm kind of always talking about debugging and looking under the hood and trying to find out what's going on, because that helps us so much to understand why something doesn't work as we expected. So there are only a few real enhancements in Apex 19 or 20. I'll point them out. Yeah, short thing about me. Mark already said I'm an ACE director. I'm the founder, one of the founders of FOX. We build a lot of interesting tools. As you probably know, there is the FOX plugin framework with 160 plugins. We have a translation app, WebSocket module for live editing and grids and tree grids. We got a nice free browser add-on, and the second one coming up, as Stefan presented today. We do a lot of forms migration, have some tools there, and same goes for Apex upgrades. And the latest and greatest, and thanks for Apex World to introducing a new category. You probably see the tiny little green thing there, commercially supported. That means that's a plugin you will find on Apex World, but there is a commercial contract behind it, and that way you can be sure that there won't be any problems when you upgrade the next version and you get support and so on. Anyway, topic today is debugging, and I really like this image. It's the perfect description of the whole debug situation. You know, one of your colleagues or clients calls you up saying, "Hey, it doesn't work anymore," right? And you say, "Well, what? What have you tried? What have you looked at? You know, did you do some research, investigate the problem?" And they said, "Well, no, it used to work, but it doesn't work anymore. So you're a smart guy. Why don't you figure it out?" And I'm always like, "Hey, come on. Show a little bit of effort at least." And to tell you the truth, if you start using debug, if you start looking into problems, you will find the solution probably very easy yourself. Debugging in Apex, the short version, it's just 4 bullet points. It's not 5, it's not 6, just 4. Activate debug in Apex. Open your browser developer tools. There was already a session before from Daniel, and there will be another one later today from by Jorge. Once you have activated debug, open the developer tools, simply run the page, and then you can analyze the debug and the console output. And in most cases, that will lead you to the source of your problems. So, of course, that, you know, we could take a break now, but there is a bit more to find out. And then first off, if you think you are unfailable, that might be true. It's not true for me. And statistically, there is 20 to 50 bugs per 1,000 lines of code. And that's a statistic across all programming languages. So it's true for JavaScript, for PL SQL. You know, overall, there is 5% of your lines of code are buggy in some way or another. Okay, so I guess that makes the question why we should debugging quite clear. It's not only we want to find a particular bug, it's also very useful to inspect weird behavior. Or if you think you're done, development, everything works, still switch on debug, open DevTools, and make sure everything works as you expected it, as you designed it. If you inherit an app that someone else built, it's a good way to take a look under the hood and find out, what's really going on. It's also good for performance reasons and so on. So what kind of tools do we have here? Of course, there's Apex Debug, the browser developer tools. You can do PL SQL debugging, for example, in SQL Developer. Philip did a session earlier today. And then if I'm referring to today as today, I just mean the span of 24 hours, this whole Apex at Home amazing conference runs. Looking at the log files is important too. Sometimes, the problem is not in your JavaScript code, it's not in the PL SQL code, it might be in between. Usually a good source there is the Tomcat, the RDS log files. And there's the good rubber duck. We will come to that a bit later. There are some countermeasures, some things you can do to avoid some common problems, I would say. So put all the code in database packages. It will be so much easier to edit it. It will be so much easier to debug it. It will be so much easier to have a good overview, and you get a proper IDE to do that. Modularize, of course. You know all of that, right? Go Mary Kondo. I don't know if she's still a hype or not, but she's all about tidying up and minimalizing and everything. So write as little as code as possible. You're using a low-code tool, so why should you write like 1,000 lines of JavaScript code? There might be easier solutions for that. Testing, of course, all kinds of tests. And pair programming is always good. So if you want to start debugging, explain your problem. And Philip also mentioned that. It's the good old rubber duck. If you don't want to harass your duck, you can take a plant, whatever. You could also talk to your colleagues, but that's actually interrupting them from their work. So try to verbalize the problem, and you will find out most of the time when trying to explain it to someone else, especially someone who has maybe a lesser understanding of things than yourself, by verbalizing the thing, you will find a solution. It works in, I wouldn't say 9 out of 10 cases, but in many cases. So, all right. So we explained the problem. We didn't figure it out on ourselves. So we want to switch debug on in Apex. And as long as you're developing the app, it's quite easy. You have that nice developer toolbar down at the bottom. Switch on debug, or you use a PL SQL API, apexdebug.enable, and you provide which level of granularity you want to have in your debug. The same you can do in the URL. It's the old style URLs, position 5. You can set in capital letters only, yes, that would be the info level, level 4, or you specify level 1 through level 9 in the browser toolbar. For the new URLs, it pretty much looks the same. You just append at the end &debug equals yes. All right. So that will work only as long as you are logged on as a developer, or for your end users, you have to switch on the application property debugging to yes if you want to enable debugging through URL settings. By default, it's no. That's just to avoid some weird script kiddies attacking your site and writing massive amounts of debug information to your database. Since Apex 18, there is also this new API, Apex Session Set Debug. So as a privileged database user, you can switch on debug for another user's session. That's very convenient. If your user reports to you, hey, I get this weird behavior, then all they need to pass you on is the session ID, and you can activate debug for them. That's very, very useful feature. So talking about debug levels, and to be honest, debugging is the wrong wording there. Actually, it should be called logging, because that's what it is. So you don't get a debugger where you can do breakpoints and step through and set watches, whatever. No, it simply is a logging facility. And as such, they figured at some point, I think it was Apex 4, hey, we should have more than one on-off switch. There should be granularity levels. And you can see there it's 1 through 9. Funnily, 3 and 7 are not used, but you could use them yourself if you want. So 1 is like the least informational level, and 9 is very verbose. It dumps out a ton of extra information. So choose the level wisely. Just a quick history recap. Oh, that's our browser add-on. There is a debug level chooser in here. There's a blast from the past. If you look back to a little bit older Apex version, so you can see how debugging looked back then. Oh wow, isn't that beautiful? Sample database application. So, and there was already this developer toolbar down there, switch on debug. And back then, before we had diff-based layouts and floating things, they simply dumped out debug information on the page. So you could actually kind of you could know what happened before something was painted on the page. That's great, right? Okay, history lesson is over. Good. So we switched on debug. We reproduced our problematic case. Next step would then be looking at debug. How can we do that? So again, developer toolbar. You click on View Debug. A nice pop-up comes up and shows you all the debug sessions. So that's probably something you want to know. Each page load, each page submit, each AJAX call is logged as a separate debug session in here. So usually the one you're interested in is the one on top. You can see there is a path info in here. And this path info gives you an indication of what it is. Show would be loading a page. Accept would be submitting a page, and then it could be AJAX or something else. This also changes from version to version a little bit, but you get the hang out of it. So once you identified your session, you can click on this view identifier and then get all the details. Another way to reach the same view is going to your application utilities, and there you find debug messages. Or you simply query the view. And this is probably what you have to do in production anyway, since nobody codes in production, right? I mean, except Jürgen, but nobody else. Everyone has a nice, clean, secured runtime installation on prod. And there you can easily query Apex debug messages. That's a very nice view, giving us exactly the same information. So that's the Apex part of things. And we all know Apex runs in the database. So the Apex debug captures only what happens inside the database. It doesn't give you any information about the network traffic. It doesn't give you any information from the browser, nothing at all. So this is simply everything what's happening in a database. And no worries, we will go into some demos in a bit so you get a better understanding. So next step, browser debug, that's your developer tools. Every browser has it, no matter if you use Firefox or Chrome or Safari, even Internet Explorer has something like that. And the cool thing about it is, once debug is activated, you can see those little nice messages in your console whenever a dynamic action is fired. So it just tells you, hey, this dynamic action fired, and gives you some additional information. Very useful. So, but all means of debugging are totally worthless if you have a bunch of code and that code is not instrumentalized. So what we get by default is Apex's debug, right? So in the Apex engine code, there are certain debug outputs, and this is what we get when it turned on. but as soon as you invoke your own code, like you invoke a PL/SQL package, a procedure, whatever, and there is tons of PL/SQL code, you need to put debug outputs in there as well. And there is a nice Apex PL/SQL API for that. It's called Apex Debug, of course. And it comes with a bunch of different functions to enable, disable, to output messages, and so on. So here's a nice example. Let's imagine that's your PL/SQL code. It's a procedure foo. It's invoked from some Apex process. So you could just in the beginning use Apex debug enter to write to the debug log that you just started this procedure and those arguments and values have been passed. Apex debug log page session state, quite useful. It dumps out the current value of all items on your current page or the page you pass in. And then you could, for example, just invoke some legacy code, your old package, function, whatever. And this is so old, it didn't use any other logging tools like Logger or anything. It did the old hardcore way dbms output. But luckily, there is Apex debug log dbms output. So whatever my package, my function might have dumped into the dbms output buffer, Apex grabs and puts into the Apex debug log. So you have everything in place. It's beautiful. In the end, you could do an Apex debug info to just state, hey, you went through all your code and it's done, it's over. Looking at the exception handler, and please, this is just an example, it's nothing you should do that way. There is Apex debug.error, which logs on error level. And this is quite useful because since Apex, I'm not sure, maybe Apex 18, whenever you use Apex debug.error, it will log the debug, no matter if debug has been enabled or not. It doesn't care. It simply creates a tiny little debug session, dumps out this error information, and you're good. So that's actually a quite interesting point. So if Apex debug error always writes a debug entry, then you could set up a Q&A check on production to look into Apex debug messages if you ever find any errors there which have not been reported. All right, another thing, and that's kind of the reverse order. So you instrumentalized your PL/SQL code and you use Apex debug everywhere, but you want to test it standalone outside of Apex, then you wouldn't get a debug log, right? Because it would just vanish into thin air. So using Apex debug enable dbms output, you can get Apex debug to log those messages to dbms output. Nice, right? So very, very thought through APIs in here. That's the PL/SQL part. When we now go to client side, nowadays there is always a bit of JavaScript code in your pages. You can instrumentalize that the very same way. There is a JavaScript namespace, Apex debug, with similar methods. You can set the debug level, you can read the debug level, you can log messages, but just be aware those messages will not be logged to the database. That would be quite expensive, I guess, in terms of network traffic. Those messages are written to your browser developer tools console. So you can see it in there, what's going on. And depending on your browser and version, it might use different colors for different log levels. All right, PL/SQL debugger. I recommend you the session from Philipp Salvesberg this morning that covered like everything that is to know there and will be on YouTube shortly. So we don't have to waste any time on that right now. Okay. Another thing that you can do is you can trace you can do a proper SQL trace very easily, simply by using ampersand ptrace equals yes in your URL. And I think with starting with friendly URLs Apex 20, it's simply ampersand trace equals yes. That will create a proper SQL trace. And then you go to your DBA buddy and tell him, hey, can we get access to the trace file? No. Since a few versions, we have a nice view, v$diag trace file contents, so we can simply query the trace file content. Isn't that nice? There is a link down there for Conor McDonald's original blog post to that. Made everything a lot easier. So I guess I'll just show you some demos here. We still have a lot of time. What do you think? Should we switch to a more recent version of Apex, or do you like this classic theme here? All right, so here we are in Apex 19. I have my little old Apex debugging playground app. So you can later download this app, and there are some test cases for you to practice your debugging skills. And it was mentioned before today, debugging is a skill like everything else. You don't want to start to use debug on the most complex problem you will ever encounter. You want to start on the tiny things, right? So this is your typical thing, at least a week's work, a beautiful form. There's an input item. You test it, you enter value, you hit process, successfully, amazing. So what you do next is you ship it to prod, or hopefully to QA, and they start testing it themselves. They do something like this, boom, there is an error. So what now? You basically are down to two options. You can take a look at the page. You see your form here, you switch over to processing. Oh boy, there's a bunch of processes and you don't want to step into that. So you want to start the practical way and you say, well, that's the ideal case. I want to start debugging now. So let's switch on debug. When doing that, the page is loaded again. We can see in the browser address bar, there is now yes here. We could also do a yes is the same as level 4. If we want to tune it up a notch, we can use level 6. That would be app trace. Since Apex 19.2, and this example is 19.1, since Apex 19.2, you would find down here also a setting what your default debugging level should be. That's a nice enhancement. So anyway, the page is loaded again. So we are trying to reproduce the problem from before. Hit process. There we are. That's exactly what we wanted. Same behavior as before. So let's view the debug. And what you can see in here, 38 seconds ago, show, and we remember show, that's the page load, all right? And then 11 seconds ago, accept process. So accept means it's a page submit, and Apex adds the name of the button that was pressed, and that triggered the submit. So it's quite nice. So take a look at that. And there's a couple of interesting things, and this is why this debugging facility is really great and helps a lot. It gives you, next to the log messages, it gives you a nice overview. So whenever you come back to that, you know which app it was, which page, and this is quite nice. Elapsed time. So that's the total time this page submit consumed in the Apex part in the database. So as soon as you hit submit, your browser sends the submit to the web server invokes ords calls Apex in the database, and then it starts taking the time until it did everything, goes back to ords, and then the time is stopped. So everything that Apex does in a database, and that also means your code in Apex, is calculated into that elapsed time. So that's nothing. It's 0.05 whatever seconds. Could be faster, right? But it's quite okay. If you have a huge elapsed time, like let's say 8 seconds, then you want to take a look at the next information here. That's the maximum execution time. And this is the maximum time a single step in your page processing consumed. To be more exact, it's the maximum time between two log entries. So let's say you have a process and you do an Apex debug info output, then you do an update, and then you do another Apex debug output, then you can measure the time of your update statement. All right, so coming back to the example. Let's say you have a huge elapsed time and you also have a huge, let's say 7.8 seconds out of 8 elapsed in the maximum execution time. Then you're lucky because you will find one query or one processing part in your app that is really slow, and then you tune the one thing and everything else is fast. But if you have a huge elapsed time and a very small maximum execution time, it means you have many tiny problems. That's not so easy to find them, but it's still possible. Okay, so this is just a first glance, and you get an idea of performance of this particular operation. So this might be a page load or a page submit, and so that's your timing. This chart here is simply showing you the spikes, which steps, which log entry recorded the maximum times. And if you click on one of those, it will lead you to the report down there. Anyway, this report gives you all the information about what happens from when Apex starts to do something, to invoking your app code, invoking your page code, invoking your process, and so on. So in the beginning, you will find a few things that are mysterious at first, but you will get used to that. So since Apex is running through ords, and ords is using a database connection pool, it at first initializes this database session that's being used. And it always sets it to a standard format in the beginning. Then it reads your metadata. So that's what's happening here. It reads your application definition, your page definition, and so on. And from that, it then knows, oh, this is app 123. That might be that is set to German or to some other language. So they have to, again, do an alter session and change NLS settings for that session. So it's kind of an important part. In here, you can verify what to expect. Okay, then it does a lot of different things. There is an interesting section. Name P2 input, that's my input field's name, and a value. Oh, that's great. Another piece of information, session state. The session state of P2 input is going to be set to that. Very important piece of information. Then it starts to run processes. At first, it runs my process do something. And that's a execute build SQL process. And as long as there is no additional information, it works. Because next line there is, hey, it's running the second process. That's process input, and there it goes, boom. And we can see that's a numerical value error. Character to number conversion at line 1. Oh, this is great. So all we have to do is look into process input. Let's do that. So do something. There was no problem. Let's take a look at this process's code. Oh, wow. It was able to run null. Process input. Oh, that's more tricky. There we can see at line 1, there is a problem. And we need a good way to avoid this problem. All right? So it's not about the solution yet. You identified the position where it happens, and then you can apply a fix of your choosing, right? So this is just to humor someone. Okay. Let's see if it works or not. No. Okay. Jokes aside, you will apply whatever fix you are interested in. So that's kind of easy. And I know it's a very simple example, but just keep in mind, real life is a bit more complex. And there's a few things you have to look for. Like the debug output we just saw there, you need to find your item name in there. You need to find session state settings. And then you can see what else happens. If the exception is raised by some package or procedure that you are calling from your process, then you will still see the whole exception stack there. So it will point you to the package that called the other package that called the other package, and so on. Okay? Simple example. Another example here, and it's probably something everyone here did before. We have a beautiful classic report, and we got some external filter fields. So the task at hand was, if a customer is chosen up here and you hit search, then the report should be refreshed. And let's scroll down. That's our reports query. So, and it should be restricted. Customer ID equals P4 customer ID. That's my field. So we did hit the button. But what happened? So we're completely blind here. There is no visual indication if something happened or what happened at all. And that's probably what your users will do. They will hit the button like crazy. Nobody knows what's happening. So remember step 2 of the debugging shortlist, open your browser DevTools. Switch to the console tab, so I'll clear it for you. Now, when we hit search, we can see dynamic action fired, refresh report, it's a native refresh. So there is something going on. But what? So we can see that's the affected element, that's my report, that's great, right? It's beautiful and easy to see, visually indicated. So that's kind of okay. Looking at the network tab, let's clear this one too and hide that. Okay, so we got more. Oh, there's an Ajax call. And whenever I hit the button, there's an Ajax call sent back to the database. So when we click on that, we even see the preview. There is a report coming back. Looking at the response, we see it's a classic report. There's actually HTML code being sent back and forth. So that's all good. What else can we see? There's headers. And I'll just make this a bit bigger here. request headers, they give us some information, form data back here. So this is what's being sent with the Ajax call to the backend. Flow ID, that's the application ID. Flow step ID, that's the page ID. That's my session, the debug level, it's all good. Widget action reset, I don't know why it's called reset. It's actually doing a refresh, but anyway. And that's about it. It's there is no more information. So let's look at something else. The session pop-up. If we look at the session state, there is no mention of P4 customer ID. It's simply not there. And that means the database doesn't know of any session value. Going back to the debug, that's my Ajax plugin, that's my dynamic action to refresh. All it does is it's running the statement. So let's see, do we find P4 customer ID in here? It's only in this place. And we know from the previous example, if there would be a session state set, we should see it mentioned here in the debug log. So it's probably not being passed in. And I know you all are sitting back home and you're smiling because everyone is running into that constantly, probably. It's an old glitch of Apex, I would say. It's it's a behavior that could be improved. Let's take a look at our report, and especially this part here. That's our query. It uses P4 customer ID, but we missed to specify this item in here. And now, can I ask everyone in the audience to send an email to Joel asking for having this one done automatically, right? Apex knows that this item is used, that it's from this page, so it should pass it on automatically. All right, once we put it in here, and that's like the most common mistake ever, to forget page items to submit, we can see it works. Beautiful. Of course, we could have found it without debugging, but you could see how logically everything is connected. Everything you send from the browser to the database, you know, it has to show up somewhere. You can, whatever you see here in your browser is totally disconnected from the database. As long as it's not being actively sent back there, the database can't know about it and will use whatever information it has. That's a nice example, right? So I guess a quick last one. Similar setup, we have a report and we have a button that does a simple refresh of the report, and I introduced a timestamp in here, so we should see the timestamp changing, but it doesn't. So, and now you can see another new feature of Apex 19.1. Although debug is not activated, we can see at least partial information of what's going on. Some dynamic action has been fired. Unfortunately, it doesn't know the name, but at least it tells me, hey, a dynamic action has been fired. So let's do it properly, switch debug on. Clear that. Boom, dynamic action fired. Good stuff. So now we know it's the refresh report dynamic action. Let's look at the network tab. because we know that some communication has to be going on. You see, there is nothing going on. So back to the console tab, and that might be a little trick here. You can also get your console to show AJAX calls using this log XML HTTP requests, which is the technical term. So when I hit refresh report now, if it would do an AJAX call, it should show it here underneath, but it doesn't do it. So why doesn't it do it? Let's take a look. This dynamic action gives us additional information. What's the triggering element? In our case, it's the button, right? There is a button click listener on it. That's simple. Affected elements, that could be many, so it's an array. Wow. It shows us visually which element is affected. So some of you might have already seen that. It's a bit tricky in here. We have one title, one region title, and a second region title. That indicates there are two regions nested in each other. So customer report is a subregion of customers, but the refresh is actually targeted towards the outer region. Oh, that's good. So let's go to that region. And yes, it's true. Customers is a static content region and has a subregion of customer report. And sadly, static content regions cannot be refreshed. So your dynamic actions, they just vaporize into thin air. So all we have to do basically is set the refresh dynamic action. Oops, go. Yeah, pick here the customer report. Save it, run it, clear this one. Ooh, and now you can see, you see your dynamic action being fired, and you can see the AJAX call down there, and we can see the timestamp is changing. Beautiful, very elegant. So those examples should give you some idea of what you can do with debugging. Yeah, it's still hard work, but it gives you all the information you need. You just need to know where to look at, and that needs some practice. So what else is new in Apex 19 Plus is if you invoke an AJAX call which logs debug output, then you will see an information in your browser console that your AJAX call logged something to debug and gives you also the view identifier. It's those tiny little things that make life so much easier. So I told you log files, ORDS is writing interesting information sometimes. You can also get ORDs by using some configuration settings to output more information to the screen. But of course, this is not for production use. Or the alert log file. And there is again another view. Nobody needs to get access to the operating system anymore. You can simply query that. It's beautiful, right? All right, any questions?
Thanks, Peter. 1 second. So we got a few questions on the chat here. First question up was, is your debugging playground application available to our attendees?
Yes, it's like the first link in here.
All right.
I don't know if you can still see that.
I can. And 2 attendees reported they had issues, like they got like a site can't be reached error message, but I just tried and I was able to get there, so I'm not sure what was going on there, but that's the URL to your playground app.
Yeah, Apex Oracle.com has some hiccups sometimes.
Oh. All right. Then next question up, can we start a debug level for one application for all active sessions? Not sure. understand what
I think you don't want to do that, but actually there is something, and so in the Apex zip file that you can download from OTN, you got some utility scripts packaged up there, and Chris Neumüller from the Apex team recently blogged about it. There are scripts included where you can enable debug for the whole instance, which is not a good idea on production systems, because you switch on debug on level 9 for everything, and that produces a ton of debug messages, but also slows everything down because debugging comes at a cost.
That makes sense, and I guess related to this, if debugging option is set to yes at the application level with a performance issue, and I think you just answered that.
Yeah, so you have to know the debug logs are actually kept in a table in a database. And every single line you write into that is handled by an autonomous transaction, so that is slow.
All right.
And just as some homework for you guys, look at different debug levels. Look at the differences between debug level 4, 6, and 9. And you will see that level 9 is producing a lot more output. Some of that is probably not meant for us. It's helping the Apex team to identify nasty bugs. But they also give you some extra information on level 9, like explain plans for report statements and things like that.
All right, there's yet another question about your debug application. So if you could just briefly show that URL again. There you go. Or just put it into chat, or we can answer that direct later. Okay, then there's another question about the console messages that you've shown. Does debug in Apex need to be activated for that to work? And if so, at what level?
Since Apex 19, debug has not to be activated to show those console messages. The only thing you will not get, as long as debug is not enabled, is the name of the dynamic action. Everything else is there.
Right, very good. And earlier you mentioned VDOLA dark trace file contents. Well, I think that's a view that's available with the database, not so much as Apex, but the question was which version is that available with?
11.2, 12.1. I'm not so sure about that. Maybe Connor or someone else can answer that later on.
Okay. And there are more questions coming in. Can you please show how to enable logging again? I don't know if you... Well, I guess we are right there. If
you hit the debug link in the dev toolbar, or you do something like that. Level 9.
You hit the little gear.
That's always a good idea, yeah.
All right. I think that's, well, I guess there are more questions coming in, so let me just scan through them. Very useful. Is it better to use Apex debug or Aura logger in PL/SQL?
I don't know. It's logger is great and Apex debug is great, and they have some different strength, I guess. If you stay within Apex, then you can use Apex debug. But if you have also some standalone PL/SQL jobs, then you might want to look into logger. But you can mix them too. I don't know. I'm not too religious on that.
Right. Another one is, how do I get all application item values recorded in Apex error log, irrespectively of any failures experienced on the page?
What's that?
How do I get all application item values recorded in Apex error log, irrespective of any failures experienced on the page? I'm not exactly sure what she's looking for.
Well, you got some views you can query. You got the Apex debug messages view. It also contains application page ID, but you can also look into Apex workspace activity log, which also puts out some errors. I guess that's it.
Right.
Oh, I like to answer this question. Any idea about Apex 21, when it will be available?
Yeah, let's hear it. Oh, I thought you were answering. Well, no, we
so
don't.
There's another one. How does trace equal yes works? So that's built into Apex. If you append to the URL old style format p trace equals yes, there's a piece of code in Apex which will then enable a SQL trace event. I don't know, the typical one.
There was one about the exception handler that you talked about, which you mentioned wasn't a good example. So the question is, how do you do it right? How do you do it properly? Like I think
I like to avoid exceptions handlers unless I have to handle a specific exception, right? If it's about, if you expect some piece of code to raise, let's say, duplicate value on index, and you want to treat that in a certain way, then use an exception handler for that. But just catching when others then null is never a good idea.
Works. All right, cool.
Well, it's hardly ever a good idea, let's say that.
Right, I think that's all we got here.
All right, so it was beautiful being here. Thank you everyone for organizing that. Martin, Adrian, Trent, great idea. Thanks for the Apex team. Yeah, I'll just show you the real dump I'm sitting in. That's not true. It's more like that. So anyway.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you all. Bye.